There's a point in growth where you stop recognizing who you are. Perhaps you know this. Now, this isn't a metaphor. This is your nervous system rewiring at a biological level. And if you get far enough in your growth and transformation journey, you experience this. But the problem is, this is the point that is most important, but it's also the point where most people give up because they feel like they're going backwards. But it's not about going backwards. It's about your body and your entire system rewiring, which is wild. It's insane. Because the ones who get to this point, something amazing happens. When our identity collapses, that's where life truly begins. And I'll explain that in detail at the end of this episode. Stay with me. My name's Annabelle Hemming. I'm a trained psychic medium, and I'm here to explore the parts of growth that people don't really talk about. They don't want to. Now, if you're watching this, most people don't subscribe, and I encourage you to, because the more people to subscribe to this channel, the more information I can give, the more knowledge I can give, and the more I can continue this. So go on, hit subscribe now, or if you really enjoy this episode, I would absolutely appreciate that. Now, yes, I'm a trained psychic medium, but this is not woo-woo. I wanted to understand growth and transformation at a biological level, at what really happens beneath the woohoo and the mystical aspect that we put on top of growth, on top of personal development. But when we give into that sense of mysticism, that this is something that can never be explained, we can never truly understand it. And then those who master it struggle to teach it because they don't know what's happening. But we live in a universe of laws. So there's absolutely no reason why healing, growth, and transformation shouldn't follow laws and mechanisms themselves. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easier. But when we understand the process and what's going on behind our growth and transformation, it makes the whole process so much easier because we're not constantly questioning ourselves. Now, if you're someone who strives towards your highest potential and you've been on this growth and transformation journey for a long time, then this is going to really land with you. This episode really is, because it's understanding the biology and the scientific understanding below healing, growth, and transformation. Yet we're exploring the side of it that isn't pretty, that isn't nice, but it's the side that real transformation grows and blooms out of. Now, the first time I stepped into a psychic and mediumship development circle was insane. I'd never experienced anything like that. I wasn't a spiritual person. I wasn't brought up in any of that way. I didn't even really know what a medium was at that point. Yet I stepped into this circle, and it was about 3 weeks in when I was sitting there. We sat under red light in a circle. It was very, woohoo, mystical. But I remember so strongly having the biggest realization that I have ever had in my entire life. I sat there and I realized that I had been alone my entire life. Now, that's such a big revelation because I didn't understand it at the time, but the way our childhood shapes us, and the way my childhood specifically shaped me, I shut so many people out. I learned that connection wasn't always safe and that love had conditions. And so many people operate under those same understandings and those same rules. And for me, that really hit hard because it was the first time I'd ever really looked at that. I always used to say that, I know there was a better version of me there. I knew that, I had more potential than I was showing, but there was something always holding me back and I didn't know what that was. And that was the first real revelation and understanding of it. But the thing about revelations is they hold grand truths. They hold really grand truths in them. And the truth can be really uncomfortable. Perhaps you've experienced this before. You've been on your healing journey, and a truth about yourself and your past and the way that you viewed it finally comes to the surface. And for me, in my truth, the emotion that came up with it was a lot of fear. Because for somebody who has blocked so many people out her entire life, there was a deep fear there. There was a deep fear there for me, and it was quite confronting. And so it's like, okay, well, someone new to this, someone new to the healing and transformation journey, they walk down this path and they get a grand revelation like that. So then what happens then? And for me, there was no real guidance there. Even though, yes, I was in a development circle, the most frustrating thing for me was that within healing and growth and transformation, which is such an integral part of being a human, of being alive, you know, it's such an integral part. And yet there's no roadmap, no specific roadmap to guide you in the direction, okay? For most people out there, it's personal experience. It's, I did it this way, so therefore, you know, I'm going to teach you that way, okay? And for me, that was frustrating. I'm a person who likes processes. I like systems. And, you know, this is why, you know, I'm not a woo-hoo person. I wouldn't just say, oh, well, it's just a mystical experience, so I'm going to leave it at that. That wasn't ever good enough for me. Perhaps it's not been good enough for you either, and you've been asking those questions of, you know, understanding growth and transformation at a deeper level. And so, you know, years later, that same question of, you know, where is that roadmap? Where is that guidance that everyone can follow, not just personal experience? You know, I developed a framework that can really explain that. And so it's exciting. I do have a book that's unpublished at the moment, but it's getting there. And it explains all of this, which is really, really amazing. So the first thing that happens that's super uncomfortable in your growth and transformation journey is the emotional aspect. All right, if you've been on this road before and you've been on this journey, you understand that, okay? When we're young, unfortunately, you know, we are humans, we are mammals, and we have to attach. We have to attach to our caretaker. Now, if our caretaker, aka our parents, if they don't love themselves unconditionally, they don't have the capacity to love anyone else unconditionally. And to be able to love oneself unconditionally, that's where transformation really is. And so for anyone who hasn't been through a self-development journey, they don't have that capacity, okay? So it's not to blame, but as a child, you know, we're looking for attachment. And so that's with our parents. And when our parents can't love us unconditionally, there's conditions on love. And so therefore we mold and we shape ourselves in order to gain that acceptance and have that attachment with our parents. And every single child does this. And so, you know, for an example that's specific to emotions, if a child shows an emotion, or if you as a child showed an emotion that made your parents uncomfortable, and for many people, especially women and girls, that emotion is anger. But for males as well, you know, we're kind of, you know, males are taught when they're younger that they shouldn't really be displaying any emotions at all, which is not true. And so, you know, we'll use anger as an example. When we're told to not display our anger, to push it down, that's what we do, because unconsciously as humans, we are hardwired for acceptance, and acceptance can mean most of the time emotional suppression. And when our system, specifically our nervous system, learns that it's not safe to display an emotion, whenever that emotion comes up, our nervous system instantly suppresses it. And so it's wild, because That's when the nervous system holds it, that's when it moves into our subconscious, because we're not consciously doing it. So therefore, as an adult, like, anger is such an important emotion because it shows us where our boundaries are and where we need to hold a boundary. If we don't have anger, we don't have boundaries. So if you have a problem with boundaries, don't think about the boundaries. Start learning to feel your anger, because that's what's going to signal where a boundary needs to be made. But if we're suppressing our emotions, if we're suppressing our anger, then we're not going to know where our boundaries are, and everything gets blurred. And so once we start to look at that and start to re-feel and rewire our nervous system into learning how to accept this emotion, it's a really it can be a really confronting process, okay? Because what happens with suppression is an emotion is a charge. It's an electrical charge that emanates through our system. And so with any kind of electrical charge, it needs to go somewhere. The most natural place is for it to go outwards, out of our system, be expressed in the world. And when we suppress it, what happens is that charge, it gets suppressed to a specific part of our body. And so if we're suppressing a highly charged emotion like anger, and I say charged, not bad or good, because there is no good or bad emotions, because our emotions are just a communication. They're just a signal. That's our interpretation in our mind going, that's a bad emotion. I don't want that emotion. Yet the uncomfortable emotions or the more charged emotions like anger and frustration, they have the more important messages. So it's so important to listen to them. But when a highly charged emotion like anger emanates in the system and our nervous system subconsciously suppresses it, it suppresses it to a specific part of our body. Okay, so say you have anger that you've been suppressing since childhood and you suppress it to your heart. Every time that emotion appears, you don't actually feel it, because before you feel it, your nervous system, who is built to protect you, suppresses it to your heart and continues to do so. So imagine if you have a lifetime of suppressing anger into your heart. Every time that is suppressed, that electrical charge gets held in your heart and temporarily weakens your heart. So think about that for a second. Because if you do that over your entire life, you're going to have a weak heart, okay? And for some people, unfortunately, when we have a weakened part of our system, that's where illness and disease can come in. That's where it can leak into our system. Now, it doesn't happen to everybody, but, you know, when we have a part of our body that is being compromised through our own subconscious suppression, it's a doorway. It's a doorway into disease, injury, illness. And, you know, looking at the world today, I think, you know, heart problems are the #1 cause of death in the world for the last time I saw, which it's just like, you know, you can understand what's going on there. But that's not just anger, you know, this is any emotion, you know, sadness, guilt, frustration, jealousy. And it's not like, you know, a parent is going to say, you know, suppress joy, because, you know, that's a desired emotion. We want to feel joyful. We want to feel excited. But when we've learned that it's not safe to feel an emotion, doesn't matter what it is, then that affects all the emotions that come through, okay? And now if we think about, you know, getting triggered and a trigger coming through, a trigger is a uncontrollable emotional reaction. So when we see someone, I'm going to stick with the anger here. When we see someone who has, you know, goes into rage, like can't control their anger and, you know, is fuming and, you know, is screaming and shouting at the top of their heads, that's a trigger, okay? That's not anger itself as an emotion. That's a build-up from childhood of that emotion itself. And so you can understand now why the charge comes through, because it's been held in one system and it's been suppressed in one system for so long that when we finally get to the threshold of what we can suppress, it just explodes. And, you know, perhaps that's not just sadness, not just anger, that's sadness, you know, grief, you know, jealousy, guilt. And, you know, in a way, when we suppress our emotions and then they come out in triggers, that can affect our behavior as well. We start acting in ways that, you know, are really unkind, that are really unnice, that, you know, kind of hurt other people. And you can understand it on that level of somebody perhaps, you know, hurting somebody else because their own self is hurting a lot. And that's all to do with emotional suppression. It's wild, isn't it? It's wild. It's so freaking cool though, for my aspect, because I'm like, wow, okay, for somebody like me, I've learned to feel my emotions. And, you know, when I talk about anger was something very personal to me that I needed to look at and experience. So it's really, once we learn to feel our emotions and they come up. So when we're going through that process of releasing that charge, releasing that suppression, what happens is we go through layers. So we go through layers, and a lot of people call these initiations. So as we start to express our emotions rather than suppress them, what happens is our system has a little bit more lightness in it. It's a little bit more free because it takes an extraordinarily large amount of energy to suppress an emotion. And then we wonder why the world's so fatigued. It's like, wow, stop suppressing your emotions and maybe you might feel better. But once we start releasing those emotions, we free up energy within our system. And so when we start to free up energy within our system, we can access higher amplitude states, which is more energy, more power running through our system. And what happens is we go through phases of initiations. So what happens when we have more power in our system, we have more energy running through us, anything that isn't compatible with that level of amplitude comes up to the surface. So that's why when you're doing your healing journey, you might have a revelation, a truth come through. And then you need to start looking at the emotions associated with that truth and start feeling them, allowing them to release. And perhaps when that release is happening, you know, it's an intense energy coming through your system. So you'll find yourself falling into, you know, illness, aches, cold and flus. You know, you'll get sick more easily because your body is temporarily compromised, because it's learning to move those emotions and release them. And that's where that energy is coming from. So therefore, temporarily our body is compromised in the moment, but it's not consistently compromised. So, you know, you might feel terrible in the moment because, you know, you've gotten a flu or you've got body aches or you've got a sore throat. But long term, you're less likely to get a serious life-threatening disease or an autoimmune system response that's, you know, not great. So you go through that, and then your system is able to hold more amplitude and more power within it. And so as your power rises, this is experienced as, you know, a lot of people call this Kundalini energy, but it's also the ability to access higher states. And so higher states are states such as, you know, joy, excitement, peace, and love. And so the initiations are the journey on that path. And so as we go higher, generally the bigger the initiations are because of the amount of power that's running through our system. So it's not like it's a one-time event. Like someone doesn't just go through one initiation and then that's it. It depends on the person, okay? So for somebody who is looking for real transformation, like absolutely wanting to completely turn their life around, then they will go through multiple initiations. For somebody who is just looking for, I guess, more satisfaction in their life, more flow in their life, then they probably don't have to go through as many initiations to get to where they want to be. But for me, in my example, I wanted to really change my life around. I had this fear of connecting. I had this fear of being seen. And, I had this pull towards a version of me that, was naturally confident, that naturally loved to be seen, that could naturally talk, because I couldn't talk before this journey. My entire system would shut down anytime there was something vulnerable. Anytime there was a vulnerable conversation, any type of public speaking, and, I would just pull myself away from it. And so the journey and the transformation for me, is being able to show up as I am today, show up confidently, and be able to give the knowledge that I have and be able to talk about my journey so that I can help clarify others in their own journey too. Now, a lot of people look at initiations as something that's really bad because they're really uncomfortable. They don't feel good, because when we reach a threshold, a lot of people talk about this as vibration, but it's not vibration, it's system amplitude. Our body doesn't just increase in vibrational frequency because it's physical matter, it's a physical body. What changes is the amplitude that runs through it. And, when we reach those initiations, they're really uncomfortable. And a lot of people pull back at that and they go, I must be doing something wrong in my transformation journey because I feel too freaking terrible that it shouldn't be like this. Because, we look at growth as empowerment, as self-trust, as self-love. And yes, it's all those things, but we need to move through all the shit and the crap in order to get there. So it's a really ungraceful process, growth and transformation. The version of you on the other side is grace, is trusting, is unconditional love. But, you have to look at all those aspects within you, all of those suppressed emotions, all of those truths, all of those memories, all of those identities in order to get to that version of you that exists. Okay. And this is where, we can get really, really ground down by all of the initiations. So for me, my journey started about 6 years ago. And, in the last 2 years, I went through the biggest initiation that I have ever been through, which was just absolutely excrucifying and excruciating. And so many times I was just like, I can't do this. This is too horrible. This is too painful. And I'll talk about this and in another episode, and specifically what I went through and what I learned from it, because it's a pretty extraordinary story. But, I wanted to give up so many times, but I just didn't. I just couldn't, because there was something inside of me that said, if you give up on yourself, what do you have? What do you have? What are you going to go to? Are you just going to go and work at an office job that is going to kill you, or, just continue to hide yourself until you get some kind of disease and die? Like, that was literally what was going through my mind. And so for me, I couldn't stop. I was being pulled along. And, definitely like 4 years of initiations leading up to the giant 2-year initiation. And for most people are like, fuck that, I'm not gonna do that, no way. But perhaps a lot of people don't want to truly transform their life in the way that I wanted to. I didn't want to settle for less, because I knew that there was a version of me in there that if I just kept going would unfold. And it's beginning to, which is so exciting. So, initiations, yes, there's something to be feared, but when we learn to embrace them and see them what they truly are, yes, they're uncomfortable, but that's okay. Okay. For so long, we're taught that being uncomfortable is a bad thing. But what about all the athletes out there? What about all of the people who commit to running a marathon, climbing a mountain, going to Everest? It's not a fun journey. It's not. They have to push their body to the limits. They have to train to get to where they want to be. And not everybody wants to do that, okay? Like I would openly admit that I'm never going to run a marathon. No way. But, you know, when we're trying to change aspects of ourselves, then, you know, we have to be uncomfortable. And, you know, there's a reason for that uncomfortableness that comes with initiations and transformation. Okay, if we think about our body, like a lot of people know about, you know, the neuron pathways that we hold within our brains, you know, neurons that wire together, fire together. We create pathways within our brains, but we also have a neuron network throughout our entire body. Our neuron pathways in our heart and our gut are the exact same as in our brain, which is wild to think, because, you know, our brain is conscious, but our heart and our guts, they work on a different level. It's not something that we can consciously force. And so, you know, for somebody who's just looking at mindset and going, you know, I'm going to work on my mindset. I'm going to work on my mindset. Perhaps they're just working on their mindset, but ignoring their heart and their gut. And so, you know, they're not actually recalibrating themselves at a biological level to truly embrace and to welcome in the transformation that comes after that. So initiations are also uncomfortable because our body is changing. We're creating new neuron pathways within our heart, within our gut, and within our brain. And for some people who are sensitive enough and attuned to their system enough, can feel that process happening. And I know for me that when I was going through this, I could feel it. I could feel it in my heart. I could feel it in my gut. I could feel it in my brain. It's not comfortable going through that process, but that's where real change comes into it. And now I'm not just talking about initiations anymore, because I am moving into the realm of identity. Identity is, you know, the pinnacle in growth and transformation. It's what everybody avoids, but what everybody needs to look at in order to truly transform and to truly grow. So for me, when I started this journey, the identity I held was that connection wasn't safe, that love wasn't safe, that it was safe to not be seen. And so I had, you know, probably 4.5, 5 years of my journey moving towards collapsing those identities. And now identities are really fascinating, because identities, just move this for a second. Identities, they live within our subconscious. So the identities that we created when we were a child, AKA going back to the attachment theory that I was talking about earlier, you know, we don't just suppress emotions when we're attaching to our caregiver and our parents. We form identities around that. We form identities, and our identities determine how we act, how we behave, who we show up in as the world, what we feel in our internal world. They are the overarching feature of our entire being. And the ones that we built in childhood and that were reinforced throughout our entire life, they're the hardest to collapse. Okay, they're the most ingrained within us, but they're really detrimental to ourselves and who we are. And it's the whole basis of our self-abandonment. So, when we go through a process of looking at our identities, and our identities, the ones that we hold when we're younger, they live within our subconscious. We're not consciously aware of them. They live within our nervous system, and our nervous system basically understands that when we were younger, we had to change our behavior in order to feel safe and accepted and loved. And so these identities that are held within our nervous system show up in our behavior. So I like to call them micro behavioral adjustments. It's, when we pull away from a hug too early, when we don't like closeness, when we move in to please somebody. There is such a vast array of identities that we hold, and it's these identities that play out within our life that determine our trajectory, determine our, timeline, our future path, our future direction. And so when you have these identities playing out, it's basically our nervous system holding strings above us and using us as little puppets. Like, we have no control over it until we become aware of it. So when you start to become aware of your identities, it becomes really confronting, because you're like, oh, have I really been self-sabotaging myself that way my entire life? Like, it's wild. You start to see them. Not only do you see them in yourself, once you start to see your own identities, you see them within other people too. And so you look around and you're like, oh my God, look at all these people self-sabotaging themselves. It's crazy. And you just want to go, stop it. Stop doing that. What are you doing to yourself? But it's not that easy, because we all have to go through this growth process, because the worst thing that somebody could do to a student in growth is open them up too much so that they see all of their identities and then they completely collapse. Okay, because it's a step-by-step pathway, because the truth is confronting. The truth can be really confronting, and if we don't have the foundations and the energetic stability to be able to handle that level of truth, we completely collapse and go sideways. And, oftentimes people will run away from the growth path completely, not because they don't have the capability of, their own growth and transformation, but because they were opened up too much too soon. And so it's just wild, because these behaviors are hardwired into our body through the neuron pathways and then played out through our nervous system. It's the level of growth that's the hardest to move through. And so it's also like, I like to see it as like the big boss at the end. It's like, you go through the emotions, you go through the levels, and, you move your way up, and then you got that big boss at the end. You're like, shit, can I do it? So in your growth journey, this is what you're confronted with: your own identities and how they played out in your life. And it takes time to repattern your nervous system and retrain your nervous system into being safe, moving away from those identities. And so when we get to a point where our nervous system goes, okay, I see the identity, I see how it's playing out in my life, and I see how it's been detrimental, let's move away from it. I call that an identity collapse. And let me explain what happens biologically when we go through this, because this is probably the most challenging part of growth, and it's the moment before transformation. It's a moment before transformation. A lot of people stop at this point and they miss that. They miss the good stuff because of this part that I'm about to tell you about right now. So when we reach this grand point of, identities collapsing, and I remember this specifically for mine. So I, trained as a psychic medium. I went and worked as a psychic medium. And then, I kind of moved away from that a little bit. I developed my own framework, and then I put it out into the world. And I went to this one expo in particular, and I was at the expo. Like, it wasn't a big one. It was in rural Victoria, Australia somewhere. And there wasn't that many people there, but it wasn't about the success or the failure of the expo. It was the fact that I had shown up with my own work, with my own framework, and was displaying it to the world that told my system, I'm safe to do this now. And so therefore, I had multiple identities collapse. I had the abandonment identity collapse because I was no longer self-abandoning myself. I had the isolation identity collapse because I was being seen. You know, I was connecting with people on what was true in my heart. And then I had the not being seen identity collapse as well, because, you know, I was showing myself to the world and who I really was. It wasn't somebody else's work. It was my own. And, you know, I was really proud of that. And what happened in the weeks after was absolutely fucking horrible. You know, I had all the emotions come up, like, you know, decades of emotions. Like, I would just start crying. I could feel my heart completely recalibrating, you know, all these memories coming to the surface. I'm like, I'm going insane here. It's crazy. And, you know, the emotions that come with it, you know, that's the initiation aspect of it. That's the higher amplitude running through the system. That's what that was. And that lasted for about 3 weeks after it. Now, this was, you know, probably about November last year that this happened. And then what happened after that was the point that people often give up on. It's when the exhaustion comes in. It's an ongoing fatigue that can persist for months. And now there is the scientific and biological understanding of it, which I'm going to read out. It's chronic cortisol elevation reduces serotonin synthesis and blunts receptor sensitivity. So fight or flight isn't just uncomfortable, it's actively suppressing the neurotransmitters tied to calm and motivation. Now, let me explain that in normal terms here. When we have an identity that runs off cortisol, so, you know, when we move out of that identity, or we're within that identity. So let me choose an identity, for example. So, you know, if you are the kind of person who doesn't like being seen. Okay, let's use public speaking for an example. Your nervous system will drive cortisol, aka fight or flight, anytime it feels like you're being seen. And so, you know, that's why a lot of people struggle with public speaking, because the nervous system flags it as unsafe. And so fight or flight comes in. And so what happens when our system is releasing a lot of cortisol, it suppresses serotonin and dopamine levels. And so we run off cortisol basically because it's energizing. It's like, you know, fight or flight comes in and we're like, oh, we have to do something, you know, whether that's fall back, whether that's, you know, act, you know, we run off cortisol. And a lot of people in the world, they run off cortisol. You know, that's just what they do. A lot of people, and a lot of successful people too, they actually make it work for them. They make their cortisol work for them. And so that's when the hustle comes in. And I, you know, even recall someone, I think I read it somewhere where this person was talking to this really successful person and was saying, you know, you need to go to therapy and you need to look at your stuff. And he was like, no way, why would I do that? Because, you know, I've created a successful life off it. And so, you know, there is that group of people that are like that. But then there's a group of people where it's really holding them back. And so when we run off cortisol, you know, cortisol takes a lot of energy to produce. It suppresses those feel-good emotions like dopamine and serotonin, so we can't really access them. And then when we're running off cortisol or fight and flight for decades, you know, our body, you know, becomes insufficient in actually producing serotonin and dopamine. And so we can't really access that feel good part of ourselves. You know, we can't really access joy. We can't really access calm because our system is hardwired into, you know, producing cortisol and running in that way. And so when we have that identity collapse where our nervous system gives in and goes, okay, I see what's been going on and, you know, it's time to repattern it, we don't just suddenly feel good. Because our body, it's not used to producing serotonin and dopamine. It's used to producing cortisol, which pushes that down. And so our entire body goes through this recalibration phase where it's not producing cortisol and it's slowly rebuilding those levels of dopamine and serotonin within us. And this can last for months. Like for me, that happened, you know, at the end of last year. I've probably in the last couple of weeks only just been feeling good and getting my energy back, because it's a full recalibration. And, you know, for some people it's so intense that they can't, you know, work in that time, that they can't function the way that they were, that it's like a tiredness and exhaustion that, you know, comes with our body, because, you know, our body is building up the reserves that have been depleted for so long. And it's not until those reserves have been fully stocked and fully up and you're starting to feel on top and amazing again, that's where the transformation happens. But so many people enter into the stage where they're like, okay, well, the identity's collapsed and everything's going well, but I'm just so tired. I'm so exhausted. And rather than allowing themselves, you know, the rest and the gentleness and the understanding that, you know, this is just a temporary process, they actually fall back into old identities. And it's really sad, because you've gone through all of this work to understand yourself, to, you know, rewire yourself biologically, to learn your emotions. And then in the final hurdle, you go backwards. So, you know, this part of it really is the dark side of healing and growth and transformation, because it's not comfortable. But knowing that, you know, knowing that in this frame, when you've reached that identity collapse, and you'll know it when you do, because, you know, the blinkers will be off. You'll see your entire life, you'll see everyone else's, and, you know, it's just a really exhausting time. But you just got to keep going, and this is where, you know, you got to sink into that real feminine aspect of you. And whether that's, you know, whether you're a male, whether you're a female, I don't give a shit. You know, it's the same for everyone. You need to understand that rest is safe, that you allow your body the time to recalibrate, that it's been through a lifetime of, you know, intense suppression and injury through, you know, the energetic responses that you've had, and it needs time to recalibrate and rest and nourish. And it's that time, it's, you know, you say, you know, the 6 months in your life where, you know, nutrition is really important, where, you know, slow movement is really important. It's the point in your life when, you know, seeing a Chinese doctor and acupuncture really land, because it's recalibrating your system and it's helping with that. And it's where you've learned that rest is safe and that there's nothing wrong with it in that. And for some people that can be really uncomfortable too, because that's also an identity that can come up, is, you know, not allowing ourselves to rest. And that's an aspect of self-love too. But, you know, it's this point, if we can get through it, that we see complete life changes. You know, our magnetism increases after this. We have boundless energy. And it's not the kind of energy where we're just like, go, 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 go. It's the kind of energy where you can be super productive in a few hours. And then, you know, you allow the rest of the day to flow. Like, you know, you learn to move with your own energy and move with your own body, and understand that, you know, flow and inspiration come in, you know, divine timing. And that's just in timing in your own system, in your own body. You know when rest is needed, you know when nourishment's needed, and it's not like you're overexerting yourself anymore. You're not, because you know your boundaries, and you know that, you know, the way that everything's unfolding is completely right and completely trusted. And you have access to those higher states too, that unconditional love, that joy. It's the point that we all want to get to, okay, in our transformation journey, but we got to go through that dark soul. We got to go through that dark night in order to get there, okay? There is no light without the dark. And it's like that ultimate initiation that we go through, because it means we can hold more amplitude in our system, which means we can hold higher states within our system, which is really beautiful. And, you know, it's not an easy thing. And that's why so many people don't actually get there. But for me, the hardest part out of it all was not fully knowing and understanding what was going on. If you know what's happening, you can lean into it. Okay, you can say, well, this is happening. It's temporary. You know, even if it's going to last 6 months, it's temporary and I know what's going to come on the other side. You know, there's that knowing. And so you can rest into that. But when you don't know what's happening, then you're constantly questioning yourself. Am I right? Am I doing this right? Am I going in the right direction? Should I turn back? Should I even have done this? So, you know, there is a cost to growth and transformation, but it's so worthy. And when you understand the mechanisms that underlie it, the process is so much easier. You have a sureness in it and you can reassure yourself that this is normal, this is what happens, and I can get myself through it. And the even better part is it doesn't just affect yourself. You know, once you overcome that identity collapse and the recalibration that happens afterwards, you become a different person. You can choose your identity from that point, and an identity that you want to embody. It affects you personally. It affects your partner, your family, your children, the wider community, all of it. You know, it's a ripple effect to everyone around you. Okay, you're, you know, a more leveled person. You're a more wise person because you understand yourself. You're less reactive. Okay, you can go to that depth within you because you know that it's safe. Because you've been there before and you walked out of that fire and you freaking survived. So, you know, knowing the dark side isn't a warning. You know, it's telling you that this is a path that you're on and there is light on the other side. And have faith in that, in knowing that it's a process that everyone goes through. And finally, we can really understand what the heck's happening into it rather than calling it dark night of the soul and that's it, off you go. You know, there's the mechanism that underlies it. And when you see that it's not just this emotional, spiritual thing, it affects us on a biological level. It affects our nervous system, you know, it affects our health and who we are during that time. You can know. You know that you can get through and you can get through to the other side. And when you do, you know, that's when the rest of your life awaits you. So I hope you've enjoyed this. As I said again, you know, if you've gotten this far and you've really enjoyed it, gotten something out of it, subscribe to my channel. I'll be doing many more videos like this. You know, I want to share my knowledge. I want to share myself, my wealth of experience. So go on and subscribe, because the more people that can subscribe, the more that I can do this. So, you know, I appreciate this. And, you know, drop in the comments what resonated with you. You know, did this give you more light on your own journey? Did it give you more faith on where you're going and how you can walk forward in that, and know that it's a temporary cycle? But when we know what it is, we're not going to go backwards in that, okay? Because the biggest challenge is when people do this process and then they go backwards and then they have to start all over again. You know, I don't want to see that happening, because growth doesn't have to be like that. It's not an endless cycle. You know, we get to a point of pure transformation, and that's when it turns from healing and growth into transformation. So let's all get to that point. But yeah, I'll see you next week. I'll drop another episode. Until then, yeah, drop something in the comments. But love you all, and I'll speak to you again soon.